Thank you, Maddie. So as Maddie said, I'm Amanda Tesco, and I'm a consultant with Thorogood based out of our Philadelphia office. And I came over here today to talk to you guys a little bit about user empowerment. I'm going to start the session today with some poll questions, and I know you guys have been polled a bit today, but I promise there'll be 2 ones. They'll be quick. The answers will be fairly simple yes or no questions. And really the objective of the session today is just to explore the world of user empowerment, but also to get you to think a bit about some of the things that your organization might be doing to empower its users. So the first poll question we'll ask, has your company invested in a technical platform for self-service? And this might be something like data provisioning work to get it into a data warehouse so that you can put a semantic layer on top of it, or investing in a user-friendly tool, something like Tableau or ClickView. So if I could just see a quick show of hands, anybody who could say yes to that statement? Okay, good number of people. Anybody who would say no, but it's something that we're planning to do? Okay, few. And anybody who says no, and it's just not something we're really interested in doing? No one, okay. And then for those of you who answered yes to that first question, to what extent would you agree with this statement? We are satisfied that our users are empowered enough to fully recognize the value of our self-service platform. How many of you would agree with that statement? Okay, very few. Agree somewhat? Okay, much more. And then people who would disagree with that statement. Okay, another group. So pretty varied audience today, I think, which is pretty good. We're going to start by talking a little bit about amplifying the investment that your organization may have made in that self-service platform. The inspiration for this session really came from a number of conversations I've had recently with some of our clients who've recently invested or in the last few years have invested in putting a self-service platform in place. And what we were finding is that that was typically a pretty easy sell for them. So it was something that you could pretty easily show somebody the value in. But as they started to put it into practice, they were finding that the outputs on the other side of it weren't necessarily what they were expecting. So, for example, one of the insurance customers that I was talking to is telling me, you know, we have a couple really good power users, so a couple guys who really know their stuff and are really creating some valuable content. But the problem is that there's only a couple people doing it. And then a kind of similar but a bit different situation, I was talking to another client in a different industry, and he was saying, you know, I've got a ton of users. I've got hundreds, almost 1,000 users of my system, but their skill level is pretty basic. And therefore, the outputs that are coming out on the other side, the quality just isn't what we were expecting. And so it's in those conversations recently where we've had more and more clients saying to us and asking how we might be able to help them to increase both the number of users that are trained and supported on their system and the skill level of those users. So we know that in many ways, the valuable insights that you're getting out of this solution is going to be a function of the number of users and the skill level of them. And so when you can consider where you might want to invest to increase those numbers, we think it's really important that you ask yourself a question. And this is a conversation that we've been having with a number of our clients, which is, what really is the value of a power user to your organization? So in these conversations, what I was being asked, or what they were telling me they were looking for, is really more power users, more confident power users, so users who are trusting the systems and trusting their abilities to use the technologies, and also better enabled power users. And when you think about how much time or energy your company wants to invest in creating those things, it's really important to think about what the value of each one of those users will be on the other side. And as we engaged in these conversations with clients, we started to see a couple common things. So the first is that you would expect that as you have more of these types of users, the speed with which decisions can be made and the quality of those decisions would be increased. Because your decisions are now being made more and more by the data, and you've got the ability to make those decisions better and faster. You would expect that as a result of that, the opportunities that the business is seeing, either to do things like increase revenues or decrease costs, would add to the benefit that you could get from this system that's been put in place. But we thought there's actually also a pretty interesting interplay with IT that happens on the other axis. And so as a result of this, we do think that there's a reduced dependence on IT, and in many ways, a lot of the costs that are associated with that. So if you think back to some of the previous sessions, there's been a lot of talk about new data sources that are available or the importance of provisioning some of this data, doing some of these new, more experimental things. I remember talking really just a couple of weeks ago with one of our clients who's in the chemical manufacturing industry, and he was really kind of frustrated with me. So, not with me, he was frustrated as he was speaking to me. He's an IT manager, and he had recently hired a pretty strong team of people to work with him. And he was saying to me, and he's from the South in America, and so he has a very strong Southern accent. And it was suggested that I try to mimic that accent, but I'm going to spare you because that would be pretty horrifying. I'm not good at accents. But he was saying, I hired all of these people who are really talented and really skilled, and I didn't expect that what they would be doing with their everyday is just pulling the same kind of mindless extracts from data to send to the business or creating really pretty basic level reports. Every day that they're spending doing that is a day further he was getting from being able to provide something that's really valuable to the business. And so in many ways, it's not just a reduction of cost and dependence, but it's the ability to allow your IT organizations to really prioritize on those things that are going to add real critical value to the business. This started to lead to another conversation with our clients, and that was thinking about, well, how are things working currently in their organizations? If you think about this black box as all of the business needs that your business might have, so all of the questions that the business might want answers to, or all of the things that they might be looking to understand in order to make better decisions, how would you split the box in terms of where those elements are coming from or where they're being created today? So what we were seeing is that a good portion was being done by technical experts. So IT was creating a lot of those basic reports for them or those basic elements. There was a bit being done by business experts, so maybe a few really good ones or a lot of relatively inexperienced business experts. But this didn't really tell the full picture. So this is important to think about in your organization, but it's also important to think about this black box over here, because there are a number of unmet needs in these situations. So there may be things that IT hasn't been able to get to yet because they're sitting in an IT backlog. Or they might be things that the business needs or could use to make better decisions, but they're not aware yet that they're available to them. And so it's not just imbalance where your IT organization is kind of being hampered down by these requests, but also that there's a good amount of latent needs within the organization that weren't being met. And so when you start to think about what you might want this to look like, you would obviously want to increase the amount being done by business experts, which would decrease the amount that needs to be done by technical experts, again, allowing them to kind of reprioritize. But this has another added benefit, and that's that in doing this, those latent needs are decreased because there's less and less in your IT backlog, and the business is much more aware of the things that they need or the things that they could use to create opportunities in their organization. So it's pretty easy to look at that slide and think, oh, that makes sense. But the hard part really is getting to a position where the business users are contributing in that way. And so we started to talk to our clients about what would really help to ensure that kind of journey that you need users to be successful. And we've came up with a few areas that we think are really important to consider. So first is around the strategy enrollment. So ensuring that you know what's going to be covered in a curriculum for a program, what you're going to train in, what success looks like, and also that you have the right people doing it. Then ensuring that they have some type of foundational learning. And this might be something that you guys are pretty familiar with. It might be very similar to kind of traditional type of technical training today or training in the tools that you use. This next part is really important though, and this is a part where it typically starts to fall down. So the importance of continued learning is very high. You need to ensure that it's a journey for these users. It doesn't stop at foundational learning, but that they continue on with that journey and that they do it in an environment that is supported by a community that encourages collaboration and that's being done responsibly and within best practices. And so we'll dive into these pillars a little bit more, and I'll try to give some examples as we go. So starting with strategy enrollment, something that you really want to consider here is how is success defined? And this is both at an individual level, so a user who might be going through this training program, but also for the program as a whole. So we're in the midst of doing this with one of our insurance customers right now. And what we've decided with them is that in terms of, in order to be able to assess users, we'll do a type of assessment after each training course that they have, and they'll move through different tiers. So it might be different tiers of user groups, but as you get through and as you kind of make it on to the next level, the amount of privileges that you have increase. So you might be able to do things like model data sources now, or you might be able to publish for a wider audience. From a program perspective, we decided that we were going to do it through an interview process with executives. So to see kind of what they have now and what they're getting from their analysts on their team, and then to monitor it over the months to see how that was improving. Also, by monitoring things like tool usage and the number of visualizations coming out of it or reports coming out of it that we thought were deriving value. Those are just some examples. It'll very much be kind of specific to your organization how you define success. But I think the main point is that it's important to really talk about this up front, because that'll really ensure that you're kind of tailoring the program to what the organization wants it to look like on the other side. You might also want to consider where users come from. A lot of times when we're talking to clients and they think about training, the first thing they think about is just those foundational sessions, those training sessions. But getting enrollment right is really pretty critical, because in many ways, the investment that you make in those users will outlive the length of the program. And so if you get people who are committed to doing it and proud to be a part of that group, there's a certain psychology in that. And you know that they'll be committed longer, and that the amount of time that they're creating those things for you is the more value you're getting out of the investment made in that training. So there's something around enrollment that we think is really important to ensure that you're kind of thinking about it up front and getting that right. And in doing that, you might do an exercise where you consider what characteristics or competencies really make somebody a good power user. And there are some listed up there just to get you thinking about a little bit. But it all goes along with ensuring that you're kind of starting the process off right with a strategy that people are bought into and a plan for enrollment that's going to work. Once you get that, giving them that foundational training is still important. And I'll go through this aspect pretty quickly, because in many ways it's probably something that you're quite familiar with. And you've probably seen some of the considerations up there. They're things that need to be taken into account, and you probably have. But there's one important aspect to this, we think, and that's that there's a real value in the curriculum being more custom. So what do you typically get? In traditional training, what typically happens is that training will be done on a sample of data. And that data may or may not really be relevant to the users. It might be a good representation of the data they use, or it might be kind of very generic. And it's typically on one technology, so learning how to use a basic data set on one specific tool. What we've found and what we've worked with our customers on is how you make this custom enough so that that experience in training is very easily translatable to what they would be doing in real life. So ensuring that they're doing it on their own data, we think is actually really important. And it does take a bit more time in preparing the materials, but in that way, as the users are learning to use the tool or the combination of tools that the organization uses, they're doing it in a real life scenario. The day training ends, they can kind of continue on with it in a format that they're very familiar with. And that really is the key. So as I mentioned earlier, it's not just about this foundational training, but thinking about where do they go from here? So how do you ensure that the users are continuing to learn and that it's not kind of a foundational training and stop, but that it is a journey that they continue on with? Something that we're working on with one of our clients right now and that we think works really well is this concept of coaching. So I think back to another conversation I've had recently with a gentleman who had just trained a pretty large number of users in Tableau, actually. And he said his frustration was that at the end of it, there were kind of two different groups of users. One group of users went through the training and on the next day went to create something and just didn't really know where to start, weren't really sure how to get the wheels going with it. The other group picked up on the content a lot more, understood it a lot better, would get maybe 80 or 90% of the way through what they wanted to do, hit a roadblock or find something that they weren't able to do, maybe a complex calculation, or they couldn't get the format to look how they wanted, and they would kind of give up at that point, or they would leave the report kind of at just being 80% done. What we're doing with that customer is shaping something that introduces the idea of live one-on-one coaching. So if in that moment those users had somebody that they could call on who could help them get over that hump, there would be a much greater probability that they kind of continue on with that journey and that experience. When I was talking to them about it, I was thinking a little bit about getting directions. So if you think about just a decade ago, how you may have gotten directions, you may have sat at your computer and typed in an address to a location. And it's no longer the days of the old fold-out maps, but you could print directions now, step-by-step directions to the location you wanted to get to. And it wouldn't matter how much you understood those directions when they were sitting in front of you. So if you're anything like me, I'm not very good with directions, so I would sit down and I would memorize the steps and I would make sure I knew where I was going, and I understood it in that moment. But once I got on the road and I took a wrong turn or there was a detour, it didn't matter how well I understood those directions because I had hit a turn that I wasn't aware of and I didn't know where to go next. What you really need is somebody who can respond to you in that exact moment in the way something like a sat-nav does or a GPS does for us now. Somebody who can identify where you're kind of at on your journey and get you back on the right track. So in many ways, you can kind of think of this coaching as that, a live person who can be sort of the GPS throughout the process to ensure that they're moving on from that foundational stage and really starting to adapt and understand how to make this much more practical and apply their learning. Something else we're doing with them is a data repository. That's essentially just a one-stop shop for them to be able to share all of the training that they've done, that we've posted up there, shared things on new features. For this client, we're doing it in SharePoint, but it could be done really in a number of different tools or technologies. But the idea is really just ensuring that these users have a place to go. So somewhere that they can go to continue on with this journey and that they can feel kind of encouraged and supported in that. And that really leads itself to the next point, which is around community. In talking with our clients, everybody seems to know that there's a lot of value in having a community around self-service. But it seems like an easy thing to kind of get deprioritized. So one gentleman I was speaking to said, yeah, we want a community, we're going to do this, but it has been on my priorities for the last 2 years, and actually I haven't done anything on it yet. And I think that's because it actually can be a bit daunting. Is it done regionally? Is it done locally? Or globally? How do you ensure that you're buying people into this idea? And so something that we're actually doing with one of our customers is doing a bit of a quick start of their community for them. And it might seem a bit counterintuitive to bring somebody else in to help you with it, but for them, we've been able to do things like start to establish user groups in the different regions. We're hosting kind of an active blog where people can share ideas. We're doing showcases on different things that users are creating so that people are communicating more and seeing kind of where the experts in the organization exist. And the plan with this has from day one been to kind of hand it back off to them and to bring it in-house. But by giving them a bit of a jump start and helping them get some of these things started and together, we think it'll give them a much greater success of just getting to it. Because sometimes that's all it is really being able to get to it and make it a priority. And then the last piece is really around best practices. And I would say anybody who's kind of had concerns over self-service, typically people in IT, this is usually the area that's most concerning to them. So how do you ensure that users are doing things responsibly? Because there's kind of a thin line between something that's very locked down and can't be used to something that presents the wild, wild west for users. So you don't necessarily want an environment that's completely unmonitored or completely uninhibited. And something that we think is important with training is to make sure that you're considering things like best practices in the curriculum. So a lot of times people think of training as the specific tools or technologies, and those things are all very important. But what we're doing in some of the programs we're working on now is baking in a lot of these best practices into the technology training, but also to have more general sessions on best practices so that users are using the tools responsibly and they're committed to that same idea, that same vision of success. The other thing is a lot of times when people think best practices, they do think about things like performance and security and using the tool wisely. But there's some other things to consider as well around the visualization or user experience. And so we're also building in sessions around things like branding, making sure that users know how to use the correct colors, that the user interface looks similar. For some companies, that might be more important than others, but it is important to consider baking that into the actual curriculum because that'll help really ensure that it's really being adopted throughout. So that takes us through most of the pillars, all of the pillars, but I think it's kind of interesting to start looking at those ideas in what a practical program might be. And so I've got a few examples of things that we've put together for clients. So this first one is something that we're working on with a global insurer right now. And you can see there's some familiar aspects of it. So the enrollment aspect, foundational learning, community, best practices, and continued learning. And what it does is it really takes a lot of those ideas and starts to create an actual kind of practical and tactical program from it. For this particular client, it's a pretty comprehensive program. So this one is quite large. It's being done globally across 4 different business units, and it's across multiple technologies. The training program here is about an 8-month program. And for many people, you might be thinking, well, that's a lot of time and a lot of investment. But the interesting thing with programs like this is that it's really very variable to the scale and shape of the different customers' needs. And so a solution like this takes into account those pillars. But this next example, which does something very similar, so has a lot of the same principles, is a much kind of smaller and more compact version of this that we're doing for a chemical manufacturer. And in this solution, this is just an 8-week program. So the foundational learning through to applied learning is just taking about 8 weeks. It's on one technology and for one business unit as a bit of a pilot. But it's got the same kind of foundational principles, but on a much smaller scale and something that'll be much more manageable to that client to see if it gets buy-in and if it's working for them. And then the obvious aspect that the continued learning is kind of ongoing. So there's an investment in that initial program, but then a commitment to kind of keeping the learning going throughout. So what are some key takeaways from this session? The first one is making it real helps with adoption. So I think this is really true. If you can make that training experience very similar to what the users will be going through when they're doing it in real life, it will make the adoption much easier, and it'll make it a lot quicker to be able to develop those capabilities within your organization. The next one is that you need support when you need support. So think of the paper map versus your GPS example. Having somebody there who can help get you back on track and get you on with your journey when you need it is really, really important to do. And I think if there's one thing that's really critical to ensuring that that foundational learning is a success, it's this aspect of it. And that leads us on to the next one, which is that it is a journey. So a lot of times people think of it as just one piece of training, but it is a lot larger than that. It needs to be considered a bit wider than that. It's not just a couple of days training, but a process and something that you need people kind of committed to and committed to continuing with. And then the next one, so everything is better with company. So if you can create an environment around it that's collaborative, that people are happy to be a part of, where there's a lot of interest and excitement in it, the chances of it growing and being adopted by more people is greater. And then the last one, which is that responsibility is required. So you don't want the Wild West. You also don't want something that's horribly locked down. Finding middle ground between the two and instilling that responsibility in users throughout, something that's really important to the success of any program like this. Okay, so that covers everything that I had today. I will be around for lunch, so happy to answer any questions. If anybody wants to chat, feel free to come and find me.